On the 16th of March 1978, the supertanker Amoco Cadiz ran aground in stormy weather just off the coast of Brittany, and her cargo of 220,000 tonnes of crude oil spilled into the sea. At the time, it was the biggest oil spill ever witnessed and caused untold damage to the local tourism industry, fishing and wildlife. In 1970, against the backdrop of increasing global oil consumption, the American oil company Amoco placed an order for the construction of 2 new vessels for transporting oil. These 2 massive supertankers, to be built by the Spanish Astilleros shipbuilding company, were the Amoco Europa and the Amoco Cadiz. The Europa would see out its working lifespan and eventually be unceremoniously scrapped in 1996, but the Amoco Cadiz would live on in infamy due to the disastrous events of March 1978. Work began on the ship in late 1970 and took 4 years to complete. The completed vessel was massive, over 1,000 feet long and 170 feet wide, weighing an incredible 230,000 tonnes. She was a true behemoth. In February 1978, the Amoco Cadiz set off on what was to be her final voyage. In the Persian Gulf, she was fully loaded with a cargo of light crude oil and was headed for Rotterdam via the Cape of Good Hope. 4 weeks later, with her journey almost over, she encountered gale-force winds and high seas whilst heading towards the English Channel. It was during this storm that, without warning, her steering gear failed completely. It was just after 9 in the morning, and she was about 9 miles north of the small island of Ushant, just off the westernmost point of the coast of Brittany. The captain, Pasquale Bardari, alerted nearby vessels to keep clear of the supertanker whilst the crew attempted to fix the steering failure. This, however, proved to be impossible, as a broken flange pipe had released all the hydraulic fluid from the steering system. The massive rudder, at the mercy of the huge waves, was being swung back and forth until it finally smashed the steering gear completely. A crew member was injured by flying metal, and all repair attempts were abandoned. Subsequently, Captain Bardari sent out a call for assistance from any tugboats that were in the area. This call went out about 2 hours after the initial steering failure. The German tug Pacific answered the call and arrived on the scene to help at about noon. However, assistance was put on hold while the 2 captains tried to thrash out a deal over the terms by which the tug could offer help. Captain Bardari had to keep calling Amoco headquarters back in Chicago to see if they would accept the terms offered by the German tug. Negotiations dragged on, whilst all the time the storm pushed the Amoco Cadiz closer and closer to the rocky coast. Finally, agreement was reached and a towing chain was in position by about 2 in the afternoon. However, due to the size of the massive supertanker and the terrible weather, the tugboat's efforts were doomed to failure. The tug was unable to turn the tanker into the wind and tow her, and at about 4 in the afternoon, the towing chain finally snapped. By 8 o'clock that night, a second line had been attached to the stern of the Cadiz, but by now it was too late. The fate of the Amoco Cadiz was sealed. Being pushed inexorably towards the Portsall rocks, she hit the sharp, rocky reef at about 9 o'clock that night. Holed below the waterline, the engine room quickly flooded, and the massive No. 4 oil tank was punctured. Being so huge, it was only a question of time before she would begin to break apart, the constant pounding of the storm proving too much for the structural integrity of the grounded supertanker. Distress calls were sent out, and the crew were airlifted to safety just after midnight. The next morning, the tanker began to break into 2, releasing 1.6 million barrels of oil, which began to pour from the wreck in a seemingly never-ending torrent. The ongoing stormy weather meant that getting close enough to pump the oil off to another tanker was just about impossible. there was nothing anyone could do apart from watch in disbelief as 220,000 tonnes of crude oil emptied along the coastline of Brest. By March 28th, the wreck had broken into 3 separate pieces, with the enormous bow section now pointing skywards, resembling the head of some kind of bizarre metal leviathan. The French government, worrying that cleanup efforts would be in vain if the wreck continued to spew oil, ordered the Navy to sink the wreck. This was done by dropping depth charges from Navy helicopters. This was successful, and soon afterwards the Amoco Cadiz finally vanished beneath the waves. At the time of the disaster, it was the worst oil spill of all time, and the effects were devastating to the local area. The oil slick measured about 80 miles in length and was about 18 miles wide. The oil began to wash up on beaches, ruining the delicate ecology of the area. An estimated 200 miles of French coastline was affected, including many popular tourist beaches. An army of volunteers from across France arrived to help clean up the mess. The French army was called in to assist, and also personnel from the British Navy came to help. All in all, 4,500 volunteers were to spend 6 months cleaning up the mess. The light crude oil that was released had been mixed with seawater by the strong wave pounding and produced what has been described as a kind of chocolate mousse consistency gunk, a mix of emulsified oil and water which was much harder to clean up than regular oil. This gunk ruined the local oyster beds, killed off all the lobsters and crabs, and killed an estimated 20,000 seabirds. Fish caught in the region reportedly tasted of petrol for months afterwards. Whole species of sea creatures disappeared from the area, only returning slowly over the following years. The French government claimed that the disaster had caused damage into the billions of dollars, and presented claims for such to the American courts. The case has dragged on for years, and Amoco was finally ordered by a federal judge to pay up to $120 million back in 1990. The wreck remained off limits to divers for many years as the Navy suspected that an unexploded depth charge was lodged against the wreckage, but it was finally opened up and is now a popular spot for leisure diving. Strangely, when divers returned to the wreck, they found that the colossal bow section was gone. Nobody knows what happened to it, it's just simply not there anymore. If anybody still wants their own little souvenir of the Amoco Cadiz disaster, you don't have to bother diving the wreck. Just find a sheltered spot on any of the affected beaches and dig down about 3 feet, and you may well find a layer of crusty black oily asphalt, a remnant of the original Amoco Cadiz cargo, which is still there to this day. Working on an oil rig must classify as one of those jobs that everybody knows is inherently dangerous. Enduring the terrible weather, the risky travel just to get to work, the hazardous materials, the dangerous working conditions. The men that work on them are rigorously trained and prepared for most eventualities. However, one thing you'd imagine wouldn't rank highly on the list of possible scenarios is that of a complete capsize of a 10,000-ton oil rig. And yet, on the evening of the 27th of March 1980, hundreds of miles from shore in the middle of the North Sea, that is exactly what happened. The Alexander Kielland was an offshore platform built in Dunkirk by the French firm CFEM for the Norwegian Stavanger Drilling Company. Constructed between 1969 and 1976, it was a pentagonal-style semi-submersible platform. 5 enormous pontoon legs were connected through a series of giant steel tubes to form a massive floating platform. These types of vessels are multifunction. They can act as drilling rigs, heavy cranes, service rigs and accommodation units. With a top-to-bottom height of over 300 foot, the structure was huge. The Alexander Kielland was used mainly for accommodation, a floating hotel or flotel as they're called, and as a result it had increased personnel capacity, up from the original 80 to around 350. However, the original 200-ton drilling derrick was still left in place on the top deck. On the 27th of March 1980, the platform was stationed in the Eekefist oil field, approximately 160 miles east of the Scottish port of Dundee, placing it pretty much bang in the middle of the North Sea. The climate out here can be unforgiving. Cold grey seas, big waves, driving rain, low temperatures. The platform was being used as service and accommodation for the crew of the drilling rig Edda. Anchored next to the Edda, the Alexander Kielland had just taken on board the off-duty crew. Together with the support staff, that made 212 people in total on the Alexander Kielland. The weather was pretty lousy that evening. Winds were gusting up to 70 miles an hour, giving 40 to 50 foot waves, and there was heavy rain and mist. Due to the poor weather conditions, the connecting bridge was removed and Alexander Kielland was winched a short distance away from the Edda, where it would remain until the next shift change. At about 6:30 in the evening, those on board the Alexander Kielland were relaxing. The crew were eating in the cafeteria, reading or playing cards in their cabins, or watching a movie in one of the 2 theatres on board. Suddenly, a loud bang reverberated through the rig. At first, many assumed this was just a large wave hitting the deck, but 2 more bangs quickly followed, and without warning, the whole structure suddenly lurched and tilted sharply to one side. Inside, people and objects were thrown around violently. Dazed and unsure of what was happening, the men were suddenly in a world tilting on its side. Doorways were now tantalisingly above and out of reach, the slippery slanted floor making it difficult to escape. Men who were able to get into the corridors scrambled to get access to the outside decks where the lifeboats were located. 23-year-old Jan Jansen was on board that night and recalled the chaos. I came out into a corridor and worked my way upward. Some were panicking, screams were heard. Some men had fallen and hurt themselves and we were all scared. I was able to press open an emergency exit, a steel door. It had to be pushed upwards and it was very heavy. At last, getting it open, I climbed out onto the slippery deck. Conditions outside were foul. The air temperature was recorded as 5 degrees Celsius, about 41 degrees Fahrenheit, but with the wind chill it must have felt much colder. It was dark and foggy, and rain lashed at the men desperately scrambling up the tilted deck. Heavy seas continued to pound at the listing rig, the whole structure swaying and bucking in the storm. 3 out of the 7 lifeboats on the rig had been crushed and lost as the platform had tilted, and the remaining ones were stuck against the upper side of the tilted platform. Regardless of the danger, some men tried lowering themselves in the boats, but it ended in tragedy. Some went into the lifeboat, but I simply didn't dare. When it was lowered, it was smashed against the platform. As far as I know, only one of the men on board got out alive, and about 10 others lost their lives. The platform continued to list, the deck tilting more steeply with each passing minute. Men broke windows and climbed onto the outside walls of the accommodation block to get outside. With the lifeboats rendered useless and no one seemingly sure of how to deploy the survival rafts, the only options looked to be to cling on and hope for rescue, or jump into the icy sea and try and swim to the nearby Edda drilling rig. The men clinging to the top of the deck could see some of the giant pontoon legs were now sticking completely out of the water, and the only thing keeping the whole platform from flipping over was one single remaining anchor cable. Eventually the strain proved too much. 15 minutes after the initial failure, the last anchor cable snapped and the entire 10,000-ton Alexander Kielland flipped over completely, flinging men into the freezing sea and trapping others 50 metres beneath the surface in the now submerged accommodation block. Men were floundering in the icy water with just basic life jackets to keep them afloat. The gale-force winds and the icy rain made a quick rescue critical if they were to survive. One of the Alexander Kielland's lifeboats broke free from the submerged rig and floated upside down to the surface. Some men stranded in the water nearby were able to right the boat and get inside. Then they managed to get about 19 men on board. Crew members from the Edda threw life rafts into the water, rescuing more of the stranded men. 7 men managed to swim over to the Edda and were hauled aboard in rescue baskets. As news of the disaster spread over the ship radios, sailors and airmen arrived in the area to take part in the rescue operation. It was the largest rescue ever mounted in the North Sea and involved 2,000 men, 47 vessels and 24 helicopters and planes. By morning, the grim tally was becoming known. Of the 212 people on board the Alexander Kielland, only 89 were rescued. The remaining 123 men were lost, making it at the time the worst ever maritime disaster in the North Sea. While the traumatised survivors were quickly airlifted to other rigs and then back to the shore, the question turned to just what had caused a rig of this size to capsize. When the weather finally eased up and visibility improved, it became clear what had happened. One of the enormous pontoon legs had sheared off in the storm, becoming completely disconnected from the rig. With no failsafe for this kind of massive structural failure, the top-heavy platform had immediately begun to list violently, the submerged parts of the rig taking on more water and increasing the angle of the list. Capsize was inevitable. It was only the single anchor cable which hadn't snapped that had prevented this. Without that 15-minute window of time provided by the cable, it's unlikely that anybody would have escaped from the Alexander Kielland. The subsequent investigation concluded that a poorly fabricated weld on support pipe D6 had caused a small crack to form. Over the years, this crack had slowly lengthened, until during this storm it finally sheared the support tube completely. The resulting stresses placed on the other supports caused a kind of domino effect of stress failure, until the entire massive D leg of the rig just simply broke off. Apart from the obvious defects in the design and construction of the rig, the disaster exposed many other failings. There was a complete lack of emergency preparedness on board the Alexander Kielland. Once the crew realised they were in trouble, it was pretty much every man for himself. There was no one to coordinate the evacuation of the rig or organise efforts to reach trapped crew members. Crew stationed aboard the flotel had little safety training. It was thought that anyone stationed on the accommodation platform didn't really need it. There was a distinct lack of survival suits. The crew had only life jackets, which provided no protection from the elements. Many of the men who survived the initial capsize died from hypothermia in the icy water. The lifeboats became jammed when the rig was inclined. While under load, they were designed to remain in position and they couldn't be released. The inflatable life rafts had a capacity for 400 people, but nobody on board knew how to release them. The standby vessels were too far away, the closest taking over an hour to arrive. With hindsight, it seems clear that a structural failure on this scale had never even been envisaged, and as a result there was little or no preparedness when disaster struck. It was clear that all of the rigs of this design had to be inspected as a matter of urgency, and a complete overhaul of the emergency procedures and equipment was needed. Over the following days, salvage divers were called in to begin the task of searching the submerged wreck and retrieving the bodies of the drowned crew. Over 50 bodies were recovered from the interior of the wreck. The still upturned rig was then towed back to Norway, where, in 1983, it was eventually flipped back over and refloated. A complete search of the interior was undertaken, and the last 6 bodies were removed for burial. The wreck was then moved to the Nedstrand fjord, where it was finally scuttled and sank. Many of the shortcomings identified from the Kielland disaster have been rectified and lessons were learned. A memorial to the disaster was unveiled in March 1986, with many hundreds of people attending the ceremony, including many of the original survivors of the Kielland tragedy. Although time has healed the wounds for some, many of the survivors never went back to sea. One can only imagine the dreadful trauma of that night for the men who somehow made it back, and the pain and the loss for the families of the men who never made that journey home. On the 26th of September 2002, the passenger ferry Joola set off on its weekly trip from the port of Ziguinchor in southern Senegal, heading for the capital port city of Dakar. She never arrived. What should have been a routine overnight passage ended up being the second worst ferry disaster of all time, a tragedy which led to the Joola becoming known as Africa's Titanic. Built in 1990 by the German firm Ingo Schleuter, the merchant vessel Joola was designed to make the 300-mile return journey between South and North Senegal, from the river town of Ziguinchor in southern Casamance region to the capital Dakar in the north. She was a stern-loading roll-on, roll-off ferry with a total passenger capacity of 580 and room for 35 cars. To navigate the waters of the Casamance River, she was designed with a flat bottom to give her a very shallow draft. With a length of 261 foot and a beam of 40 foot, she wasn't a particularly large vessel, but she was sturdy and well built, a workhorse who spent the first decade of her working life shuttling goods, vehicles, cargo and passengers between the two ports. As you can see from the map, the geography of Senegal is odd in that it almost completely encompasses another country, the Gambia, in its central region. This made the ferry important to many people in the southern Casamance region of Senegal. Casamance is one of the most fertile agricultural parts of Senegal, and people needed the ferry to transport their produce to sell in the capital. Without this sea route, they had to undertake a perilous 2-day overland journey around the Gambia to reach Dakar, or travel directly through the Gambia, which was also difficult. Increased security at border crossings had brought long delays, and having to pay bribes to the Gambian border officials and tolls to cross the river meant that this route was out of the question for many of the poorer residents of the Casamance region. The Joola was out of operation for a year from August 2001, undergoing maintenance and having her port engine replaced. During this time, the government was constantly under pressure to have the ship back in service. By the end of the summer of 2002, she was returned to service, but making only 1 return trip per week instead of the usual 2. This reduced workload was in order to give time for the new port engine to be run in properly. However, this single weekly trip led to a huge demand for tickets, a demand which surged at the end of the holiday season. On September the 26th, 2002, the Joola began loading passengers, cargo and crew for what was going to be her final voyage. Although she had a capacity of only 580 passengers and crew, over 1,000 tickets had been sold for the trip. Add on to that the number of children under 5 who didn't need a ticket, and the many stowaways who would hop onto the boat for a token bribe, and it's easy to imagine that the estimated figure of 1,800 people on board is probably accurate. Eyewitnesses at the quay reported that the Joola was already listing heavily to port by the time that she left Ziguinchor at 1:30 p.m. Indeed, it's reported that some would-be passengers did not board the ferry at all, as she was listing so heavily to one side. The Joola made one more stop at the small island of Karabani, where around another 200 passengers boarded the already overcrowded ship. As the Joola headed out to the open sea, it's estimated that she had around 2,000 people on board.
It was a hot night, and many people opted to sleep up on the open top deck. Many other passengers, however, stayed on the lower decks, as there was a live band playing and there was much dancing and merriment on board. The last communication from the crew came at around 10 p.m, reporting no problems and calm seas. However, at around 11 p.m, the ship, now some 23 miles off the coast of the Gambia and heading north, ran into a freak squall. This mini storm brought high winds, rain and rough waves. On board the Joola, untethered cargo began to slide around, moving gradually down to the lowest side of the ship and increasing her list to port side. As waves began sloshing onto the cargo deck, the ship's lighting shorted out, plunging the ferry into darkness. The Joola was hopelessly top-heavy, and the flat bottom of the boat did nothing to help keep the ship upright. Disaster was inevitable. Just 5 minutes after encountering the storm, the Joola rolled over to port and capsized. From the few eyewitness reports that we have, it seems that many of the passengers survived the initial capsize, but were doomed to drown in the sea as little in the way of rescue was forthcoming. After the storm had passed, some local fishermen who were close by were able to pluck some survivors from the water. Other passengers who had been thrown into the sea were able to scramble onto the upturned hull to await rescue. All the while, banging, shouts and screams could be heard emanating from the interior of the Joola as those still trapped inside clamoured for rescue. Only one life raft was deployed, and it remained floating listlessly at the side of the upturned hull. The rescue response coordinated by the authorities was incredibly slow to get started. Relatives waiting on the quayside in Dakar were still being told at 8 o'clock the following morning that the vessel was running late, but to be patient, it will be here soon. This was a full 9 hours after the Joola had capsized. One father, waiting on the quay to pick up his 3 sons, only found out that the ferry had sunk by hearing a radio news report on the 10 o'clock news. None of his children had survived. Rescue vessels finally arrived on scene by around 11 a.m. and began to retrieve what few survivors remained, mostly those who were clinging to the still floating hull. The last survivor was a 15-year-old boy who was lifted off at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He later confirmed that screams could still be heard coming from inside the Joola as he was winched off the upturned hull. The rescue vessels had no means of reaching the trapped survivors, but their plight was soon ended. The Joola sank shortly afterwards, taking all those still alive down with her. The fate of those left on board doesn't even bear thinking about. The numbers make for harrowing reading. From the estimated 2,000 people who were on board the Joola, there were only 64 survivors, 63 men and 1 pregnant woman. The official accepted figure for the number of lives lost is 1,863. And this made the sinking of the Joola the second worst maritime disaster of all time. Some in Senegal believe the actual death toll to be well over 2,000, but this figure has never been confirmed. Divers who went down to the Joola 2 days later were able to see hundreds of bodies floating inside the upturned wreck. The divers, led by local environmentalist Haider El Ali, were able to recover around 300 bodies from the wreck. Other corpses washed up along the coast in the following days. Some bodies were identified and returned to their families for burial, and others which were never identified were simply given a number and subsequently buried in 3 mass graves. Many bodies were simply never found, probably having been swept out to sea, eaten by sharks, or some possibly still remain inside the sunken ferry. In the end, around 550 bodies were recovered, with the whereabouts of at least 1,300 bodies remaining unknown. With depressing familiarity, the officials investigating the tragedy ended up playing the blame game, with nobody wanting to take responsibility for what had happened. The government initially cited poor maintenance by the crew as the root cause. Former Navy Commander Ousseynou Kombo declared that overcrowding could not have caused the accident and that only the storm was to blame. The President of Senegal, Abdoulaye Wade, admitted overcrowding was a factor, but then went on to blame the captain for the capsize. As Captain Issa Diarra had perished in the sinking, he was not able to defend himself against this claim. The inquiry took a year to reach the conclusion that no single cause could be found. The report stated that the captain probably was at fault, but no conclusion could be reached. In effect, the sinking of the Joola was just an act of God. There were a couple of resignations from government ministers, but no formal charges were ever brought, and the case was closed. Unsurprisingly, the families of many of the victims were not impressed by the findings of the inquiry. Why was the rescue response so slow? Was a distress call even sent? Why was the ferry allowed to set sail, being so obviously overcrowded? Why was only one life raft deployed? Many questions remained unanswered. The Senegal government has never even returned to the wreck of the Joola, even though she sits in clear water at a shallow depth of only 23 metres. Many families were never able to bury their loved ones, prolonging the sense of grief and loss. A monetary offer was made to compensate the relatives of the victims, but this has been subject to many delays, leading families to form ad hoc pressure groups to lobby the successive governments. 2 small memorials were created to remember the dead, but each site seemed somewhat unkempt and forlorn, and neither received much in the way of visitors. The disaster was barely mentioned in the global press, and outside of Senegal, the Joola capsize is largely unknown. Many of the groups campaigning for more recognition of the Joola tragedy were especially frustrated by the unveiling of the African Renaissance Monument, a 50-metre tall bronze statue which now dominates the Dakar skyline and cost the Senegalese people an estimated $27 million. Officially opened in 2010, it's the tallest statue in Africa and was commissioned by President Wade to commemorate the emerging spirit of the African peoples, although many critics wryly pointed out that being designed by a Romanian and built by the North Koreans, it hardly exemplified anything of the sort. People were angry. If the Senegal government could afford to splurge $27 million on this, why was there still missing compensation for the still grieving families of the Joola victims? As expected, no believable answer was ever forthcoming.
The photograph on your screen shows rescue boats jostling around the exposed stern section of HMS Thetis, a British submarine which had got into trouble during sea trials in the shallow coastal waters of the Irish Sea on June 1st, 1939. Of the 103 men on board, only 4 would escape. If, like me, you're wondering why all those men trapped were doomed to die when the stern section is clearly visible and accessible, then stay tuned for a tragic story of bad luck, poor judgment, delayed action, and what is possibly one of the Royal Navy's dirtiest little secrets. During the mid to late 1930s, as tensions with Nazi Germany were on the rise and a Second World War looked increasingly likely, the British Royal Navy, well aware of the threat posed by the superior German U-boats, were pushing hard to get the British sub-fleet up to muster. 15 new submarines of the Triton, or T-class, were commissioned in 1935 to replace the outdated OP and R-class subs that the British had been using. The 270-foot-long HMS Thetis was the first T-class to be built by the Camel Laird Company in Birkenhead. She was launched on the 29th of June 1938 and was dogged with bad luck right from the start. During her first set of sea trials in April 1939, it became apparent that a steering gear had been connected incorrectly, so that when steered to starboard, she actually turned to port, and vice versa. Also, when preparing for her first dive, the bow planes, which control the rate of the submarine's descent, became jammed solid in the hard dive position, and the trials had to be abandoned. 1 month later, her torpedo bay equipment was tested, and following this testing, the torpedo room gear was painted with a coating of enamel paint. Now it seems that the painter was either in a hurry or working sloppily, as he painted a thick coat right over the torpedo tube doors. This is a small mistake, but one which was going to have huge ramifications later on. By the end of May, HMS Thetis was set for a second set of sea trials, and on the morning of June 1st, 1939, she left Birkenhead and headed out along the north coast of Wales to perform her first dive. On board were 5 officers, 48 crew, and a further 50 passengers. Most of these passengers, who were just along for the ride, were shipyard workers from Camel Laird, but there were also some Navy officers, dockyard managers, and even some of the caterers who were there to supply the sandwiches, beer, and pies for the reception after the sea trials were over. Sailing on ahead of the Thetis was the escort tug Greebcock, on standby in case of any emergency. By 1:30 in the afternoon, the Thetis was ready to commence her first dive. The escort tug had offered the opportunity for any of the passengers to get off before the diving test, but all 50 passengers had elected to remain on board. So at around 1:40, senior officer on board the Thetis, which was Lieutenant Commander Guy Bolus, sent a short message stating simply, "Diving now." However, the crew of the tug the Greebcock saw that the Thetis was having trouble getting beneath the waves. For about an hour, the Thetis floundered around, circling and settling ever so slowly lower into the water. Just before 3 p.m, the crew on the tug heard a loud whoosh of air and watched as the Thetis quickly disappeared beneath the surface. The commander of the tug, Lieutenant Coulter, wasn't happy with what he'd seen. The Thetis was supposed to settle at periscope depth, then submerge and release smoke flares. None of that had happened. The Thetis had simply disappeared beneath the waves. So Coulter decided to send a message through to Admiralty HQ in Gosport, but owing to the short range of the ship-to-shore radio, his message couldn't be sent directly, but instead had to be relayed via the local telegraph office. Unfortunately, the boy whose job it was to take messages from the harbour through to the telegraph office on his bicycle suffered a flat tyre on the bike and had to spend about an hour repairing the puncture. By the time the HQ in Gosport received the message about the Thetis, it was already 6:15 p.m. Meanwhile, for some reason having failed to drop anchor, the escort tug had unknowingly drifted some 4 miles distant from the actual position of the Thetis. Navy officers in the Gosport HQ were already worried, having had no direct contact with the Thetis for over 3 hours, and so upon the receipt of the worrying message from the escort tug, a search of the immediate area was ordered. The Royal Navy destroyer HMS Brazen, already close by in the Irish Sea, was dispatched to help locate the Thetis, but she began searching in the area where she found the escort tug, which was some 4 miles away from the actual position of the stricken Sob. So what had gone so horribly wrong on board the Thetis? Well, upon commencing the diving test, Commander Bolus had discovered that the bow of the submarine seemed too light, and that all efforts to dive were proving fruitless. On the trip out from Birkenhead, Bolus had remarked that the Thetis was riding high in the water and was heeled over slightly to port. The submarine's trim seemed off, so Bolus ordered that number 5 and number 6 torpedo tubes should be checked to see if they were indeed flooded to act as ballast, as if not, this would possibly account for the extra buoyancy at the bow. The way to check these tubes was to open a very small stopcock in the torpedo tube door, and if any water came out, then you knew the tube was flooded. Now, remember the overzealous painter who covered everything in the torpedo room in thick paint? Well, he had inadvertently blocked the tiny inspection tube. When Torpedo Officer Fred Woods opened the test cock, only a drip of water came out. Taking this as proof that the tube was most likely empty, Woods decided to open the inner hatch to inspect the tube, unaware that a fatal mistake had been made. The outer torpedo tube door was in fact wide open, and the tube was fully flooded. Upon releasing the catch on the inner door of torpedo tube 5, the door immediately flew open, and hundreds of gallons of seawater began flooding the torpedo compartment. Woods and another man tried in vain to close it, but the pressure of the rushing seawater prevented them. The sudden weight of the water rushing in, combined with the bow planes being set for hard dive, caused the Thetis to pitch forward sharply, and she began sinking almost immediately. The men quickly decided to abandon the torpedo room, but a bent butterfly latch made it impossible for Woods to close the watertight door behind him. This resulted in 2 forward compartments being flooded before they were sealed off. The Thetis, now weighed down with tons of seawater in the bow, sank straight down 150 feet to the seabed. The bow ploughed into the muddy bottom, bringing the sub to a juddering halt. All attempts to free the vessel by running the engines full astern were in vain. The submarine was crippled, stuck 150 foot down on the seabed. Now, the Thetis was carrying enough air to be submerged for around 36 hours, but with the extra 50 passengers on board, this time was cut in half. The men kept calm, chatting about sport and what kind of reception they would get after they were rescued, but as the hours passed by with no signs of rescue from the surface, Commander Bolus began to worry about the dwindling air supply. The crew hit upon a plan to help the rescuers above, and by dumping most of the drinking water from the stern tanks, they could make the rear end of the Thetis buoyant enough to rise to the surface. After all, the submarine was 270 feet long, and they were in only 150 foot of water. Now the plan worked, and the stern section of the Thetis broke the surface, rising well out of the water and plainly visible to anyone nearby. Unfortunately, as the rescue vessels were looking in the wrong area, darkness fell before anyone caught sight of the stern of the submarine, and the Thetis remained undiscovered overnight. As time passed with no sounds from above, Bolus next asked for volunteers to begin the perilous task of evacuating the ship through the aft escape hatch. The crew had Davis escape gear, but few had been fully trained in how to use it, and of course most of the 50 passengers on board would have no clue on how to escape a sunken submarine. First up to volunteer was Captain Harry Oram, Senior Fleet Officer. Now, at first sight, you might think that this is just a case of some top brass wanting to get his backside off the ship before everybody else, but in fact it was very much a selfless act. Firstly, to get off the boat through the escape hatch, you had to flood it while inside to equalise the pressure before you could open the outer hatch. With the sub tilted on such a steep angle, there was no guarantee that the outer hatch would even open properly, and the trapped occupant might drown in the airlock. Also, even if a man did manage to get out, it was likely that there would only be an empty sea above to greet him, and the likelihood was that he would drown before being rescued. Because of this, Captain Oram had messages taped to his clothing, outlining the situation on board and the necessity of getting fresh air into the vessel. If his body was found, it could then still help the remaining men. Captain Oram and Torpedo Officer Woods went first, successfully making the 20-foot ascent to the surface. By around 7 o'clock the following morning, lookouts on the Brazen had finally caught sight of the stern of the Thetis sticking up out of the water and the 2 men floating nearby. The men were quickly rescued, and the first real news of what was going on had reached the surface. Vessels were soon on scene, swarming around the exposed stern. Steel hawsers were fixed around the stern and a diver was sent down to try and connect an air hose. Unfortunately, the diver only had 30 minutes of air and failed to connect the hose in time. Meanwhile, sailors milled around the exposed stern in lifeboats as the hours dragged on and on. On board the Thetis, conditions were becoming unbearable as the carbon dioxide built up and the oxygen had begun to run out. Bolus had ordered the men to try and escape 4 at a time through the escape hatch. It was a desperate plan to try and get at least some of the men off the Thetis and make the remaining oxygen spin out a bit longer, but it ended in disaster. One man panicked as the chamber was being filled, tearing out his own breather and jamming the outer hatch as he tried to open it prematurely. The crew then opened the inner hatch and dragged the 4 men back inside, but 3 were already drowned. The survivor stated that the outer hatch was now jammed and further escape was impossible, but 2 other men decided to give it a go anyway. Shipbuilder Frank Shaw and stoker Mac Arnold, by working together, got the jammed hatch open, and they too made it to the surface, where they were picked up by the waiting boats. By now, many of the men on the Thetis were either already passed out or dizzy and uncoordinated from the lack of oxygen. They were in no fit condition to perform even simple tasks, never mind organising a risky escape from a crippled sub. We will never know for sure exactly what happened, but something went wrong during the next attempt to use the emergency escape hatch, and it resulted in the sudden and complete flooding of the Thetis. As tons of seawater filled the submarine, The steel hawsers snapped under the strain, and the Thetis sank back down to the seabed. At just after midnight on June the 3rd, the news was broken to the anxious relatives waiting on shore. The official statement was, "There is no hope for the remaining men in the submarine." It wasn't long before grief turned to anger. Why had it taken so long to find the sub? Why wasn't the exposed stern made secure with extra hawsers? Why were the other Navy divers left stranded on a platform in Scotland waiting for a boat instead of being flown to the scene? And most of all, why had nobody cut a hole in the exposed stern? The steel plating was only 5/8 of an inch thick, and salvage vessels with cutting gear were there on site, but apparently they'd all been told to stand down and wait. The findings of the official inquiry did little to dispel the idea that the whole thing was a whitewash, a cover-up of the failure by the Admiralty to act sooner. For example, one of the findings by the inquiry was that the deaths of the 99 men was mainly due to, quote, "the failure of those inside to escape." Now call me cynical, but that's on a par with blaming a shooting victim for not dodging the bullet. And by declaring that there was no party with any culpability, the inquiry effectively denied the grieving families any chance of compensation. Worse still, a recently unearthed memo found in the National Archives points to a deliberate decision being made by the Admiralty not to cut into the stern of the submarine. With war looming, it seems that all efforts were made to preserve the structural integrity of the vessel so that she could be reused, even if that meant sacrificing the lives of the men on board. The facts do seem to support this macabre theory. After all, the Thetis was salvaged from the seabed and refitted for active duty. She was renamed as the HMS Thunderbolt and saw much action during World War II before finally being sunk by depth charges. She lies today somewhere on the floor of the Mediterranean Sea at around 4,500 feet down. The remains of her second crew are still on board. As for the original 99 men who perished, their remains were removed from the Thetis when she was salvaged, and they are buried in a mass grave in Holyhead Cemetery. A memorial to those lost stands there to this day, but one has to wonder, would any memorial actually be necessary if the men in power had decided to rescue the trapped crew instead of deciding to salvage a submarine just to save some time and some money?